Howdy Grubs, happy gay Christmas, or as most people know it, Halloween. I've got my costume on. I'm supposed to be the Terminator, or Monty Mole, or Kamina from Gurren Lagann, or any number of cool sunglasses, guys. If you've learned anything from me, I love cheap things, so a costume that only costs $2 that lets me be 100 different characters is a hecky of a deal. So let's get started with the next part of the Game & Watch series. I'm finally on to the ones that everyone are most interested in. It was fun looking at the single screen Game & Watch games and seeing where things started out, but most people nowadays only have an interest in the multi-screen ones because they're realizing that the idea of the DS was much older than they initially thought. I mentioned how the multi-screen was a natural evolution for the handhelds because of the size restrictions of the screens. They could only hold so many images, and they could only light up so many at one time, and they could only do one thing at a time. So if you wanted to complicate or make more involved gameplay, you'd need to incorporate another screen that has its own separate goals. In an interview with Kenji Ino, Gunpei Yokoi, the Game & Watch's creator, said, "We added the extra screen because we wanted to distinguish the newer Game & Watches from the older ones, but figuring out what to do with them was a challenge. To just take a single screen game and put it on two screens would actually make the single screen game feel kind of worse. However, when we connected the gameplay to the second screen in a meaningful way, it became many times more fun." From the sounds of it, Mr. Yokoi and his team were putting the cart before the horse, deciding it would have two screens long before they knew what they would even do with those two screens. Luckily, it played out well in the end. Interestingly though, the Game & Watch multiscreen inspired more than just the DS. According to Mr. Yokoi, it was the inspiration for the Game Boy original. When we released the Game Boy, people often said, "Oh, they must have wanted a portable Famicom." That wasn't the case. My goal in developing the Game Boy was to go from one hardware, one software model of the Game & Watch and the one hardware multi-software system. That's also why we chose to make it black and white, as opposed to the full-color Famicom. When I look back on it now, it was a tremendous success. If we had made it color, I don't think the Game Boy would have enjoyed such enduring popularity. This is also a big reason why Game & Watch and later his WonderSwan console never really had an emphasis on color. Mr. Yokoi said that to him, it's not about the color. Once you're playing, you're not thinking about the colors, but the game and how fun it is to play. But he also believed that lacking color is a big reason why these could never compete with the home console like the Famicom and Super Famicom. It's kind of funny because this is a prototype of the argument that gameplay makes the game, not the graphics. I think in this instance, color doesn't really negatively impact a game at all. At the time, yes, the Game Boy could not have handled color, not well at least. When we compare it to the Game Gear, the system that did have color and a backlight, it was big and it was prone to failure and it had a lot of issues, but the Game Boy worked fine. That's really all you can say, is it worked fine, good enough. It was not great, but the WonderSwan, which was black and white, did really, really well. Even though it also had its own share of ghosting problems, it was nowhere near as bad as the Game Boy original. So maybe he was onto something there. It's just saying that color makes the games worse. It's such a weird statement, but you know, he's the famous guy. I'm just a mole on the internet. So the idea behind the multi-screen wasn't about adding more visuals, but instead about improving the gameplay, which is how you should innovate your consoles, improving the gameplay. Oil panic. This entire generation is defined by having two screens, with one on top of the other in a vertical layout like the DS. The gameplay at the top is usually a completely different way of playing from the bottom screen, but work together in unison to make a new, complete experience. Alongside this generation was three horizontal releases: new widescreen, tabletop, and the Versus series. But the vertical line is their longest, spanning from 82 all the way to 89, just 2 years before I was born. And nothing makes me sound nearly as old as saying that I'm almost as old as the Game & Watch. The idea of oil panic is incredibly simple, maybe too simple. You play a gas station attendant when a leak springs from the second floor of the gas station. Oil is leaking everywhere, but like my boss when I worked at a gas station, he refused to close under any circumstance. Seriously, the sewage backed up onto the store floor from the grates in the bottom of the store, and for a week we had to go to the bathrooms across the street. None of us would clean it because you need a special training to deal with bio-waste, by law. But he kept the store open, and he just left the doors open so that it would make the store stink less. But boy did it stink really bad around the store. I worked third shift, and this was when I started putting Vicks Vapor Rub like just below my nostrils so that all I could smell was the Vicks Vapor Rub. Not sponsored, but you know, it works. I'd rather smell the Vapor Rub than liquefied feces. And people wonder why I don't work for minimum wage anymore. I worked third shift, and this was in the middle of COVID, COVID as well, so the place across the street wasn't open 24 hours anymore, so I had to hold it in for 5 hours every day until my boss clocked in. It's okay, unlike my boss, the boss in Oil Panic had a plan. It's not a good one, but the only thing worse than a bad plan is no plan at all. He wants you to catch drops of oil in your bucket on the top screen, then pass them to your boss's bucket on the second screen. If you miss even a single drop, you get a miss, and if you dump the bucket on one of the customers, you get a different kind of miss. My first thoughts on this game is that at first it's very hard, but I'm playing it on the Retrofab version first, as I always do, as it's the most authentic experience available without dropping money on an original. It's a hard game because your boss is constantly moving and you have to pay attention to where he is at all times. The drops never stop and you can only carry 3 drops, so you need to squeeze dumping the bucket in wherever you can. It's made all the more difficult by the screen positioning. The top screen and bottom screen have a much larger distance apart than the original DS, or at least it seems that way. It makes looking at both screens simultaneously a little difficult. Other than that, it's a really basic Game & Watch game. It's fine for a launch title, but it's not great. I think this still could have been a single vertical screen title if they rotated the original screen, but they wouldn't have had space for a wider view of the city bottom, which would be unfortunate because this is one of the better backgrounds. They really kept one-upping themselves in terms of design and their backgrounds. In other design, their box art stays essentially the same as the widescreen series, except instead of gold boxes, they went back to single full-color boxes. In America, they kept similar boxes to their widescreen series, but moved some of the graphics around. The art and title are on the left, with the series Nintendo logo and screenshot on the right. On the reverse side, you get a really good shot of what the device looks like, as well as what the clamshell looks like when closed. I haven't talked too much about the handheld shapes themselves yet, and that's because all the prior devices have been flat, thin slabs. This was Nintendo's first clamshell design. This generation was really full of firsts. When closed, the Multiscreen series looks like a mint tin or a jewelry box, with a shiny reflective label and plain text saying the game name. I've said this before, but Nintendo's brand of minimalism looks exceptionally dystopian. It's so bare minimum, it's kind of uncomfortable and unsettling. The back of the device just has some legal junk and manufacturing info alongside the battery door. Once opened, the upper half of the screen has visible screws, the title, and 2 recessed pockets. These were so the device could fully shut without pressing the buttons down. It might look like the handheld was bigger than the others, but once closed, it's about the same size as the widescreen series, but much, much thicker. If you want to try Oil Panic for yourself, there's a few ways you can play. Through Retrofab, link in the description to check out the originals, Game & Watch Collection on the DS, and through Game & Watch Gallery on the Game Boy. Gallery 1 is gonna have some quirks. Since the GB was a 10:9 screen and only had one screen, they had to mess with the aspect ratio of the 2 screens to make them both fit. The top screen is shrunk and given some somewhat sizable black borders. The bottom screen, however, stretches all the way to the left and right sides of the screen, so the play area is significantly smaller than the second screen, but it's more important to know where your boss is than where you are, honestly. After all, the hard part of the game isn't collecting the droplets, it's getting rid of the oil before the next droplet hits something flammable. I've mostly been talking about the Gallery series for these games because these are the most accessible. You can easily emulate them even on your phone. But a lot of Game & Watch games were on e-readers or hidden as Easter eggs in other games. Oil Panic, though, is also available through the DS game, the Game & Watch Collection. It only makes sense that the dual screen system would have the game that inspired it. This collection was available through the Club Nintendo Rewards program, which back in the day, it actually used to be really awesome. Like in the Club Nintendo Rewards program, I've talked about this before, but they had an actual Game & Watch reproduction that they made of the first Game & Watch ball, and you could get that. And then they had this Game & Watch collection. They had games and stuff like that that were specially made for Club Nintendo Rewards members, and I guess it just wasn't as popular here in the US, so they just stopped doing it. But it's just one of the cooler things about Nintendo died, and that sucks. There are plenty of copies available of the Game & Watch collection, but I don't recommend paying $30 for just this, Donkey Kong, and Greenhouse. It doesn't even include the remakes from the Gallery series. Weirdly, the second collection game only has Octopus and Parachute, and you need to play them both at the same time. They had 13 vertical multiscreen games, and only remade 3 of them, plus 9 more on the eShop. Really unfortunate, because Game & Watch is getting preserved, but not preserved that well. And it really sucks because Nintendo is like, yeah, let's bring back the Virtual Boy, and not the Game & Watch series that is less well preserved. The Virtual Boy only had 22 games. They're all available and easy to find, but what really needs preserving is the Game & Watch series. And it's unfortunate because the only way to preserve them is to remake them, because they weren't ever made to be video games. They were made as calculator games, so they actually have to be remade in order to function at all. But the games are incredibly simple and should be possible. I mean, it is clearly possible. Idazos from Retrofab has reproduced every Game & Watch game, but Nintendo won't even try. Gallery is still the most accessible way to access these games. Even if you don't emulate, the carts only go for $10. I'd still recommend emulation though, as eBay shipping prices are nuts. You'll pay $10 for the game, and then $20 for shipping. Now about the Gallery remake. This one is a strange adaptation. On the top screen, we have Mario catching oil in one of 3 spots while holding 2 buckets at once. You move left and right, and you can change the buckets by pressing A or B. When Mario goes to dump the oil, he'll dump out the side closest to the window, so you'll need to swap to dump both buckets. On the bottom screen, you can see Bowser dumping oil into the roof, and then you can see Mario, and then just below that you can see Yoshi, and then the people below. This is a huge addition because Bowser's positioning tells you where he is dumping oil, so you can see exactly where the oil is dripping in Mario's position without looking at the top screen. You could play entirely on the bottom screen, it'd be a little harder, but it's possible. Yoshi will wander back and forth like the boss, but will grab oil dumped out of the window as long as he's facing that general direction by using his tongue. He has a little bit of an extra distance, which makes it a little easier to play this version. It's still not my preferred version though. But Yoshi eating oil is already pretty weird, and Yoshi will eat anything I guess, but the weirder part is the scoring bonuses. When Yoshi eats a bucket, he spits out fire, which creates a block. If the block is on the right and gets hit by Yoshi's fire after that, you get some coins and a bonus point. If Yoshi spits them onto the left, he creates a ladder for Yoshi to climb up, then he blasts Bowser. By blasts, I mean he blasts him. He shoots fireballs, eggs, watermelon seeds, or even pulls out his blicky and sends his ass to Satan. This one is pretty easy, but definitely has a multitasking feel to it. Which version is the best to play? In my opinion, they're both kind of boring, but I like the original, but the remaster one on Gallery 1. It's much easier to play this original because it's on a single screen. Every other game I've played, I say the remake is better, so you might be surprised that I like the original better this time, and that's because of the feeling that the original oil panic invokes. It's supposed to be hectic, like I'm doing too many things at once, and I think the original is better at conveying that panic, especially on the higher difficulty. The remake has a lot going on, but it makes it much easier to play, so the juggling isn't really juggling once you know how things work. Is it worth playing? I'd say for historical value. This is the first vertical dual screen. It's the DS's dad. But gameplay-wise, this isn't anything that couldn't have been done on the original. Mr. Yokoi said that they had the dual screen idea before they had the game ideas. That worked for it, and this game shows that, but I don't think it benefits from having multiple screens. This could have easily have been done with a single vertical screen. The extra screens just add another thing to babysit without making the gameplay warrant actually needing both screens. If this was a tier list, I'd give it like a high C or a low B, because it's not even great for a Game & Watch game. There is a risk and reward system by scoring more by dumping fuller buckets, but I don't think most will realize that from their first few plays unless they read the manual. But that's it for this one. Don't panic though. Oil will be back soon with another game. Don't forget to tip your YouTuber. I take likes, subscribes, and comments. And after that pun, you're welcome to dislike. But I'll see you later. Bye. I'm off to go do cool mole stuff, like smoking and drinking in the school parking lot or something. Actually, I probably shouldn't do that. I'm too old to be in high school parking lots.